So in this session, we're going to talk about some alternative. I had titled these slides earlier, non-traditional, but alternative works probably a bit better because some of them go back a ways now. So basically, one of the issues is when we think about what we enjoy the most and what we enjoy the least, where would grading fit there? Which category would it fit in? If I think most people would probably agree that grading is not one of the most enjoyable aspects of teaching, and it probably is not one of the most enjoyable experiences that students have as well. And part of the concern that many people have about traditional grading systems is that it can lead to students becoming discouraged, losing motivation. I know in my own classes, when I teach large classes and I have regular tests and so forth, lots of lower stakes tests, but when I used to give a midterm exam, which was usually 15 to 20% of the grade, some students would just kind of give up when they ended up with low scores on that, and they'd stop coming to class and so forth. And the what?
Having some speaker issues.
Okay, let me fix this. This is the first time in the room today, and I got sloppy. Okay, can you hear better now? Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry about that. It was just going through the laptop microphone and instead of the regular microphones here. It's been a long year, but in any case, going on, Ken Bain makes a distinction between three different types of learners: strategic learners, surface learners, and deep learners. And for anyone who's read Ken Bain, or how would strategic learners be classified? Anyone? You can open your mics. We don't have a terribly large group here, so we're type something in chat. Oh, okay. So Kara's not here. Well, actually, we had really crappy microphones before, so it's better now. Can you hear us now? And actually, if I don't see it, I'm assuming she doesn't. Okay. So anyone want to describe this distinction? I think it's pretty relevant to what we're going to be talking about.
Is it they're going for the A, not necessarily understanding the content?
Yeah, some students focus primarily on just getting high grades because they see that as a key to whatever they're going to do later, either to getting a job, to going to grad school, and so forth. And they see it more as a game to get those scores in terms of what hoops they have to jump through to get the highest scores possible, without necessarily being all that concerned with how much they learn. Surface, and those are the students who are often, arguing for an extra point or two here or there, and they're arguing over points, and they're trying to come up with strategic ways to get the highest possible grade. And that may not be the incentive that we really want people to work on, that we probably rather see them focusing on learning rather than on maximizing their grades. But the incentive systems we've set up throughout our whole educational system tends to focus more on grades than on learning. Surface learners are students who are in many of our classes, especially gen ed classes, who want to learn enough to get a satisfactory grade so they don't have to take the course over again, and so forth. But deep learners are those who really get intrigued by the subject, who really want to learn more and understand more. And one of the things we'd like to do is develop incentive systems, which may include the way in which we assess student work, that focuses more on deep learning, where we shift the motivation from maximizing grades to maximizing learning. And that's the basic purpose of pretty much all the alternative, or essentially the purpose of all these alternative grading systems. That students generally, their interest and motivation can be deterred by grading systems. And yeah, we pretty much already said that. So one of the issues, though, that students have in terms of their focus on grades is this concept of metacognitive illusion, that the practices they use, strategically to get the highest grades are not generally the same as practices that result in the most learning. For example, there's a distinction between space practice and block practice. Block practice is what students think of as cramming, where they study for prolonged periods of time right before an assessment. And when we look at the research on this, and there have been dozens of studies, maybe more with space practice. I know there's at least dozens. All the research suggests that space practice, when you space out your studying, in fact, when you space your studying out where the next time you review a topic is right when you're at the verge of forgetting substantial amounts of it, you end up recalling things much better. Yet what students tend to do is they tend to cram. They tend to study right before a test or some type of an assessment, and pretty much everything they learn or they're able to store in the short-term memory during those cramming sessions tends to be lost within 2 or 3 days, and very little of it is maintained. But with space practice, it does lead to deeper long-term knowledge. The other things that students tend to do, well, cramming and block practice kind of go together there, that's sloppy. Repeated rereading is another tactic that students use. And what the research suggests is that in general, reading something a second time gives you a slight increase in the amount that you recall. Beyond that, there's no statistically significant difference in the amount that you recall, but it does significantly increase your perception that you've learned more, so that when students read things over and over again, they remember the words on the page, they remember the images, they remember all the things, and it seems to make sense until they try to apply it. And when they try to apply it in an assignment you give them or an exam, they feel that they really learned this, but you're not testing them fairly quite often. When in fact, what they've really done is they haven't really learned it as deeply, that we learn things much more deeply when you engage with them, when you practice and so forth. And so if we want to encourage students to focus more on learning, we want to perhaps get them out of the habits of block practice, cramming, and repeated rereading. And also, I should have put this up there, is highlighting. Students highlight a lot. In fact, in some of the book groups that we've had here on campus on Make It Stick and on Michelle Miller's first book and so forth, where pretty much all the highlighting research is presented, a lot of faculty members in the reading group had highlighted all the portions that suggested that highlighting is not particularly effective in increasing recall. Actually, Todd Surprisek on our podcast had a great suggestion where he noted that some of his students were using many different colors for highlighting, different colors for each of the different types of things they were highlighting. And what he suggests to his students when he does that, somewhat facetiously, is maybe they should use a black highlighter on all the parts that they don't need to remember. But in any case, an important thing that research tells us is that giving students feedback is important for learning, that assessing student learning and giving them feedback along the way is critical, but grades are perhaps a little bit less so in terms of if our focus is on grading. And what a lot of the researchers and the people coming out with new books on grading right now note that we really have only had grades for a relatively short period of time. A 100-point scale was first introduced in Harvard in 1837, and Yale introduced a 4.0 system that we still use in 1813. And it took 70 or 80 years pretty much for those to percolate out through the rest of the educational system. Before that, students would receive feedback and we would receive, they'd either pass or not pass classes and so forth. But grades are fairly recent. In terms of the history of universities, grades are a relatively recent phenomenon. And if you want to shift to something other than traditional grading, a really common practice, and this is especially useful in STEM classes, is using mastery learning approaches, where you give students a limited or an unlimited number of opportunities to demonstrate their learning, and only the highest grade is recorded. This works really well if you have classes, and that's why I said it is often used in STEM classes, where you can have algorithmic questions where students can be faced with similar problems with different applications automatically in Brightspace, or before that in Blackboard and so forth. And you just let students try things over and over again until they master it. Now that works pretty much in all fields, but in fields where you don't have that automated grading, it's a lot more work. And one of the things we'd like to do is to keep the effort, more of the work focused on students on behalf of their learning, rather than us having more work in grading a larger amount of work. But certainly the more we can give students feedback along the way, the better it is. And, you know, with just allowing resubmissions of work is a really useful way of achieving this. But if you're doing something where you have to spend a lot of time evaluating the work, you probably don't want to give students unlimited attempts at it, as I think people who grade a lot of student artwork, for example, will recognize. But if you give students feedback along the way as they're building projects, giving them feedback early and guiding them in more productive directions can be really helpful. And as I said, it's a little bit easier to do that in STEM fields. In areas, and again, this applies primarily to STEM, adaptive learning platforms do this automatically, where, you know, many of these are based on artificial intelligence systems, and, you know, and had a much better reputation for using as well, where students are basically given where some learning objectives are built into the program. Students are tested initially to see what areas they know well, what areas they don't know well, and then basically they're given a customized individual learning path that's tied to what they already know coming in, and they get more resources on the things where they need more assistance, and they spend less time on the things that they already have mastered. And that works really well, but we lose some of the social aspect of learning when students are working only with adaptive learning platforms. We haven't quite moved to a state where machine instruction works at the way that some people expected it to. But adaptive learning platforms are really helpful in doing this, and they take all the grading work on at least part of the course out of the hands of the instructor and puts it in the hands of the computer, basically. And then of course you can build on that and give your own applications, but it's a good way of getting students up to speed. And it's basically a mastery learning approach that's all automated. And in math and in economics and in psychology and many other areas, adaptive learning platforms have been shown to be extremely effective, both in increasing student learning and also reducing some of the equity gaps that we see in performance. That everyone tends to benefit when these platforms are used, because students are using their time more efficiently by not using a one-size-fits-all type of instruction, but students are getting more instruction in the areas where they need it, and they're not wasting as much time on other topics, which you can't do in a large classroom where you're trying to teach a large group of students all at the same time. So again, it's very focused. It builds in retrieval practice, which is a really effective method of increasing long-term grading. So that's something that's been done for quite a while. Mastery learning approaches go back 30, 40 years in terms of widespread use. But there's other systems that have become really popular in recent years. One is specifications grading, which was developed by Linda Nielsen, who was the director of the Teaching Center at Drexel. She wrote a book called Specifications Grading, and she's been advocating this for quite a while. And it's really started to take on a lot more interest in the last few years. And basically, what specifications grading does is it combines a number of things that have been shown to be effective. It uses the transparency and learning and teaching approach that we talked about in a workshop yesterday. Basically, it makes it very clear to students exactly what you expect from them in terms of each assignment. You develop a very clear rubric on that. And basically, everything is graded on a pass-fail basis, essentially. So you don't have students arguing over whether their score should be an 87 or an 88, whether it should be an A- or a B+. What happens is they either met the criteria, the specifications for the assignment, or they didn't. And their grade in the course is determined by how many assignments they met the specifications are. There's different ways of doing it, but you could have some bundle of, something just popped up. I'm not sure what that was. Well, it's okay. I'm not sure. An error message popped up, but it seems to be working. In any case, so there's a number of ways in which you can go from specifications to grades. One is, as I said, you just set the number of activities students have to complete to a certain number for an A, a certain number for an A minus, a certain number for a B plus. The other is you could have different sets of specifications for grades. So for example, if you're going to use some testing, to get an A, you might have to complete perhaps a test you can take over and over again, like a mastery learning test at a 90 or above. To get a B, you have to meet it at this criteria. But basically, either they meet the criteria or not. And if they meet all the criteria for B level work, they get a B. If they meet all the criteria in the bundle for an A level work, or you may have different types of projects. You could have a more elaborate thesis requirement if it's an upper level course for students who want to get an A, but for students who don't want to or who are happy with a B in the class, you might have a lower level requirement. It may be a shorter paper, maybe a different type of project and so forth. But the key is you set the precise criteria and you describe it well so that students know exactly what's expected of them. And typically students are allowed at least some attempt to redo work. So what Linda Nielsen suggests is that you have a certain number of what many people have called later oops tokens and so forth, basically where they're allowed to do a certain number of things over again, but not necessarily everything, so that instructors don't get burdened with much more grading. But basically the goal is to get away from a focus on numeric grades and having students focus on developing their competencies, because then it's clear to students what they have to do, and it's clear whether they've met the criterion or not. And so this is, this is something that's becoming increasingly popular for lots of reasons. And multiple attempts are typically allowed on some or all the assignments. Again, it varies. And pretty much that's what I've been describing. Any questions on that? Now, so that's, again, it's a little bit less traditional than a mastery learning approach, which has become the norm in many disciplines. Another approach is contract grading or labor-based grading. And in this case, with contract grading, specifically what happens is instead of the instructor specifying what the conditions are, what the bundle of requirements are that must be satisfied to get each grade, the students and the instructor jointly agree on a contract which lays out what the objectives are going to be. And it might include things like the number of allowed absences they have, that if you want to get an A, you can't miss more than 3 classes or something similar, or you must complete a certain number of drafts or papers or assignments that meet that, again, sort of like the specification criteria, that they basically get they've either satisfied it or not. And a common way of implementing something like this is with light grading, where they either get a check mark or they get they don't get a check mark, or they might get a check or a check plus or something similar. But basically, it's not a very fine gradation. So you don't have to spend as much time grading. And you, again, typically would allow students to do more. And you just set the grade criteria. Well, you jointly agree on a grade criterion based on how this might work. I had this was a simple version of this in a political science class back when I was in college, where the instructor gave people 2 options typically. One was he used 3 tests, but the tests could be replaced by a term paper. So you could take 3 term papers, you write 3 term papers, you could, on different subsets of topics, you could take 3 exams, or he gave some of us the option of writing a single paper. So essentially it was like a contract. We agreed at the beginning of the semester, for each of the tests, whether we take a test or write a paper or do a single large elaborate project that we came up with the specifications at the beginning. Now that was Typically, there's much more variation in this. And again, generally, there's movement away from high stakes activities, such as a single graded instrument or even 3 exams or papers. But it's that same sort of approach that you let students determine what they're going to do to demonstrate that, and you meet with them typically and agree to that contract. And some of it is, well, we'll get to the labor-based grading in just a second. If it's a writing class, or maybe a political science class or some others, or history class, you might have to submit a certain number of responses to assigned readings. And one concern about this is that students know exactly what they have to do. They know what progress they're making towards it. And, if they have to complete 10 specific short writing assignments, for example, they can keep track of where they are and how many of those they've met at any time, which again takes a little bit of the pressure off, because they just have to meet the criteria. They don't have to worry about whether their average is going to be an 89.9 or 90.0, et cetera. And so one argument for this is it can take some of the anxiety pressure away from grades, but one disadvantage of it is that students don't really get their grade until the term is over, when they see how many of these things they've met. And also students often tend to procrastinate, as we all do. But again, if you work with the students and you remind them and keep them on track, encourage them to stay on track, this can work very well. This is used a lot in writing classes and English composition classes and similar things, similar type projects. Labor-based grading is a bit more of an extreme form of that, where you simply evaluate people on the amount of labor that's embodied in the project. So the more work you do, the higher your grade, which is kind of implicit in the number of drafts, papers, or assignments completed, the number of reading responses, and so on. So basically, the more work you do, the higher the grade. Again, as long as it meets minimum specifications. So it does still have some aspects of specification grading in most applications. The most extreme form and the increasingly popular form of alternative grading is ungrading. And basically, with ungrading, you literally don't assign grades on any work that students complete until you submit the final grade. And we'll get to that final grade in just a minute. Basically, what happens is you specify learning objectives for the class. You tell students what they have to master. You talk about the learning activities they'll be doing. And essentially, students reflect on their learning journey throughout the class. And they'll submit work to you, or they'll submit those reflections to you. Sometimes that's done by having a blog that they're contributing to, which might be shared with the whole class. Sometimes it's a reflective journal that they share with you. And you can see their self-evaluation of their progress as they move through this whole learning process. And instructors will provide students with feedback on the work. So if they're submitting writing samples, if they're submitting artwork, if they're submitting, what else? This is most common in the humanities, where students are writing papers and so forth. It's really common in introductory English classes. It's pretty common in sociology classes and history classes and so forth, where students are still doing work, but instead of you assigning grades to it, you're just giving them feedback. And similarly, if you have a project that they're going to be working on, maybe one big project that's carefully scaffolded from the beginning to the end of the term, you give them feedback at each stage of that, and then they can improve that either by resubmitting something or on their next application if it's something they're doing repeatedly. And certainly this is something that's often used in many art and creative arts as well, where you provide students with feedback on the work and encourage them to improve their skills, but you don't actually assign grades, but they reflect on the quality of the work, and they reflect on the progress and on how much they've learned and what new skills they've learned along the way. And one of the goals of this approach is to help students improve their metacognition, to get a better understanding of what they know and what they don't know, and what skill and the extent of their skills development, so that they can become more self-directed as learners in the future. So there's some really good, objectives of this approach. And since we typically, or we certainly have to assign final grades, and we're supposed to assign midterm grades at lower level classes, and many of us do it at both. What happens in general, most advocates of ungrading will provide students with, even if not required, a midterm grade. And again, everyone has to get a final grade. And the most typical way in which this is done by ungrading practitioners is they'll have students fill out a survey, often a Google form type of thing, where they'll rate themselves on the rubric that you shared with them at the beginning of the term. And they'll talk about what they've learned, how their skills have developed, what areas they need to still improve on, and so forth. And they submit their recommended grade, and then you meet with each student. So this doesn't scale very well. This can work in a class of 20, 30, or 40. It's probably not going to work in a class of 200 or 300 or 400. But basically what happens is you meet with the students, you talk it over, and a lot of people who've never done this generally are a little skeptical of this approach, but the people who are doing it claim that it works really nicely, that students generally have a very accurate understanding of how much they've learned and how they're doing. They generally say maybe 1 or 2% of the students will overstate the quality of the work, hoping to get a better grade. But what they generally claim is that what's much more common is that students will tend to understate their actual performance. And that's especially true for female students and for first-gen students and for students from historically minoritized groups, that they tend to understate the amount that they've learned in the course, perhaps because of past experiences with education. And the two concerns that many people have are, first, the Dunning-Kruger effect. We know that the students from many, many studies, including those done by Dunning-Kruger originally, is that people who have the lowest levels of skills often have the highest estimate of their skills, or that people who have not attained a very high level of mastery in subjects often overestimate the level of knowledge. And I think many of us have experienced that ourselves, that the more we learn about a subject, the more we recognize how much there is still to be learned. But students who are at an earlier stage of that, many students will tend to overestimate their own performance. And so that's one concern, that people may overestimate their grades. Again, practitioners, though, say that in practice, this is very rare. The other type, though, problem is stereotype threat, which is students who come from groups who generally have had, as a group, a history of less success, or are concerned about that because, again, they don't see themselves represented in the student body or in the professoriate and so forth. They may be subject to stereotype threat and underestimate their ability. And so, again, most of the people who do ungrading are very likely to say that they tend to remind students of just how much they have learned and refer back to their progress in learning over the course. And certainly those are much more pleasant conversations to have. And they generally say that those conversations are 3 to 4 times more likely than ones where they have to remind students that they really didn't quite do all that well, or they didn't complete all the work that they were expected to do, and so forth. So again, people who use this, it becomes almost like a cult, that they very strongly believe in this, and they see it as a way of building more implicit motivation, and that it's a very effective way of increasing the focus on grading. So if you have let me just put it in a link. You can either type it. What I have put together here is a set of resources. I'm going to copy the link. I'll put it in chat since more people are in Zoom. And I put together some research on all these things that talk about all of these. And let me just jump over to that for a second, just so you can see what's there. There's a lot of studies that have been done. SUNY, when I was a Fact 2 chair, we put together a group on innovative assessments for student learning, and they've been collecting information on innovative assessments. That there's a website that they're putting together and maintaining from people using innovative assessment techniques throughout SUNY and wider. And that's a very useful resource, and that'll be growing quite a bit more. They did a webinar series, and there are videos from that webinar series from last spring. There is a, oops, I duplicated this. In any case, we did a podcast with David Clark and Robert Talbot a few weeks ago, actually, and they have a new book coming out on grading for growth, where they fused each of these techniques. It's basically looking at ways of modifying our grading systems so that they do shift the focus more to learning and away from trying to maximize grades. This was a podcast on mastery learning. Linda Nielsen's book is really good, and we did a podcast with her a few years ago now. Here's some resources on labor-based and contract grading. And there's a number of good books and essays and blog posts and some podcasts we've done, and many others have done, with people who've been advocating ungrading. So those are the major things I wanted to talk about. But does anyone have any thoughts about any of these, or comments or suggestions? Has anyone tried any of these alternative approaches? Okay, Karen, which have you done?
I did. My situation is a little bit different because I'm in the art department, and I have done, I guess, what would be called contract grading, where I created a series of bundles where students had to complete one bundle to go C, 2 for B, 3 for an A, and they had to get each one up to a portfolio level. And it worked pretty well. My question, I just had a question, because as far as ungrading goes, I did a poll last spring asking students how they would feel about that, and they were so negative. They did not want to do that. And I'm just wondering if anybody else has had that experience. They were I was kind of surprised. I thought they would be like, yes, we want to evaluate ourselves. They're like, nope, don't want to do that. So I'm just curious.
Has anyone else tried it and had that experience? I haven't moved to ungrading myself. I can tell you, though, that in the people we've interviewed a number of people on the podcast who've done ungrading, and what they tend to say is there is student resistance to it, because that's not what their experience is. They're used to having us assign the grades, and they're used to working to get the highest grades that they can. And the thought of having to grade themselves is somewhat scary to them, because on the one hand, they're afraid that if they overstate the quality of the work, they might be embarrassed about it. And if they understate it, it's going to hurt their grades. And, so there's a lot of anxiety about that. And usually people try to get past it by focusing on how, once you leave college, you're going to have to learn things on your own. And it becomes really a useful skill to be able to evaluate how well you understand something and what areas you need to work on. And that's a selling point that often has helped convince people that it's not so threatening.
Yeah, I think I might try that in my capstone class, which is a smaller class. Some of these things seem very daunting in terms of just the size of classes. Like the contract grading I only did with my 400 levels, which is a small class. I can't imagine sitting down and making contracts with 25 students. That seems a little daunting.
Even my seminar classes are normally 30 to 35 students. So
Yeah.
I haven't been able to do it, partly because the amount of meetings
Right.
we have and
Yeah.
setting these things up is just a bit too challenging for me.
Yeah, I think that my 400 levels have really liked the contract grading because they feel a little more in control. So far, I only had one person kind of go for the B. Well, he didn't go for it. He just didn't he didn't complete the third assignment, so. But they usually want to go for the A, so.
And Stephanie, your hand was up.
Yeah, kind of connected to that, and my internet connection just kind of blipped out, so I'm sorry if I missed it just now, but how has any of the research or your resources, John, talked about like how well any of this works with like freshmen? Because I could imagine, like Kara was talking, that it would work well in a 400 level class, and I agree. But I get a lot of freshmen in classes like English composition. So, and that's where I would be most inclined to kind of try this out, but I don't know if that would just freak them out too much or not.
And I've seen mixed things on that the people who use it and several of the people we've talked to use it in basic writing composition classes. So, and they say it works really well. The two people who were on the podcast recently who had the book coming out this summer, though, the Grading for Growth book, said that they tried ungrading both, but they moved away from it in part because when they tried it, or at least for lower level classes, because for it to work well, students have to develop some basic metacognitive skills that they found that freshmen generally didn't have. That it didn't work as well because students often could not very well evaluate how much they've learned, because again, they haven't had much practice with doing that. And so, but they're teaching math. So, you know, it may be a somewhat different experience. I know Josh Eiler pretty much critiques any other approach other than ungrading, and he's been using ungrading himself. And he also has a book coming out on, I think it's called The Scarlet Letter or something like that. I know it, you know, in a different context, but in any case, you know, he argues that it works really well with freshman writing classes, and they're much more motivated, they're much more engaged, and they don't argue about grades because they have a say in how those grades are established.
Okay, thank you. I'll check out some of the resources that you mentioned.
And there's many more coming out. There's a lot of people talking about it and exploring it right now too. Carrie.
Yeah, kind of going back to Kara, this will be my first semester teaching here. I'll be teaching jazz dance. And I got both my undergrad and grad degree in dance. And we never did ungrading when I was in my grad degree, but when I was an undergrad, we did it in one of my choreography classes because our teacher found it was hard for her to like grade us really, because it's all like movement based and then like what feels good to the student as a choreographer. So it was hard for her. So she made a like target that we looked at, and like each circle had a different, so it was kind of like a rubric. Each circle had different requirements in it, and we kind of had to use the rubric to grade ourselves. So it was nice to have that to like look back at and like kind of guide us in our grading of our own selves and in the class. And then at the end of the semester, she had us come in for like a one-on-one meeting and kind of defend where we felt like we fell into that category and like talk it out in person, because students can kind of BS it in like a writing portion and kind of like come up with, well, I did all this outside of class, but in person, kind of like talking it out more was harder to like lie to your professor in person. So it made it like we really had to defend what we did and how we got through that. And I think it really helped us. I mean, we were seniors at that point, so we felt like we could connect better as opposed to like when we were freshmen trying to figure it all out. But it was nice having that rubric to go back to. And so it was kind of like we had something to fall back on that the teacher had set, but we had to defend how we fell into that because it was very broad categories.
I think that's kind of similar to what Maggie Schmal does, right? She did.
Yeah, she did ungrading in her criminal justice class
and
too.
they met like that at the end. I think she had.
And she thought it worked really well.
Yeah. And she had the final meeting with the students to have that one-on-one. I think she had said in the winter breakouts too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And again, from everyone I've talked to about anyone who, with the exception of the two authors of Grading for Growth, whose experience with it, partly because they were teaching larger, you know, basic math classes, where students don't always recognize where their level of skill development perhaps as well. You know, in general, people said in those conversations, people might have listed on the form a grade that was too high, but they back down as soon as you remind them, well, remember when you were doing this, and remember when you took those 2 or 3 weeks off from the semester and you kind of disappeared and you didn't turn these things in. And they'd say, well, yeah, I was just kind of hoping for a higher grade. And they didn't really argue for the higher grade. They tended to back down really quickly with everyone we've talked to. And I think Maggie said there was 1 or 2 students who came in a little bit high, but it wasn't very many. And again, she also said it was more common to have people underestimate their
Yeah.
ability.
And even if there was, I think she said there was maybe one student or 2 that came in and they had different opinions on the grade, but then when they started talking, they ended up agreeing with
Mhm.
where Maggie was with their grade, yeah. So they pretty much kind of agree at the end, kind of with where they stand. I think they understand the process.
And so many of our students are focused just on getting the highest grades, but that grade tells you very little about what skills they've actually developed. If they're given a list of skills that they should be learning in the class, the learning objectives for the course, when they finish the course and they can say, you know, I've demonstrated mastery of this specific skill, that puts them in a much better position when they start, you know, building a resume, if they're going out in the job market, or if they're going to move on to other education. They have a much better, they have more language to describe what skills they've mastered and what areas perhaps they might need to still develop, in ways that many of our students, while they're developing skills in the class, they're not always very skilled in identifying what skills they've developed through their educational process. And, you know, a lot of schools are moving towards a process of making more explicit the types of competencies, the career competencies people pick up. And I know we're talking about that here in the administration. There's some discussions of that. And both SUNY Oneonta and Buffalo State have explicitly started integrating career competencies into their courses and into the majors, so that students can say, in this class, I developed, you know, team leadership skills, or in this class, I developed these things, and they're able to connect certain things that they've done to the skills that, you know, people might find useful when they leave academia. So, which is another argument for moving towards a more skills-based approach and away from the simple numeric grades, which one thing that many people note, that the whole notion of grades originally was first used for grading things like beef and, you know, grading meats and so forth before it's sold to the public. And that maybe that's not a very useful measure of the skills that students have acquired in college. Any other thoughts? What I'd really like to see is a panel, and I did try to solicit people to see if anyone had been using these techniques. What I'd really like to see is if anyone is trying these things when we do winter breakouts next January, it would be really nice to have a panel of people who are actually using these things. I've done some of it, but I certainly haven't moved to ungraded. I can't do that with 300 to 400 students in a class. It's just not possible. But I do mastery learning, and in my upper level classes, I've experimented with pretty much all the others in some form, especially in capstone courses. But maybe I'll move to ungrading by then, but it would be really good to have a panel, and Maggie will be back, I think, for January. She's going to be out for half the semester in the fall, but I think she's going to be back in January. So, but yeah, if any of you are doing this, when we do a next call, it would be great just to have a report on what you tried, how it worked, and so forth, because a lot of people would like to get away from the grading system that we have now, because it's not working that well.
Doesn't make any sense to me anymore. So I'm really very interested in exploring other options. And I would be very happy to be part of any group that wanted to explore that, especially with some of the, like I said, I can do what I'm doing with the 400 classes, but it's not going to work with 300s. And yeah, I really struggle with grading. It doesn't make sense to me anymore. So.
And you know, if we focus the shift back to grading, maybe we won't have to worry as much about things like GPT and so forth, because if students are really focusing on skills development, they don't want to just copy and paste solutions coming out of a computer, maybe. Or at least we can hope. Any other thoughts? Any other questions? Or it is an area where a lot of people are working. It's in the news. It's, you know, on professional development networks. There's a lot of people talking about it. There's a lot of experiments going on, and it would be nice if we could get together and have more people doing it here and just, you know, sharing their thoughts and reactions, because it might spur other people to move beyond this, because, you know, students would be much better off if their focus was on mastering the discipline, and mastering and improving skills, rather than trying to get that extra point here or there, you know.
I know I would have loved this more as like a dance student, because a lot of it is like, I mean, ballet, yes, there's very like right and wrong, but also like it's also up to like your body and how like you move as a dancer. Like I have a total hip replacement, so I dance completely different than the person next to me who doesn't have a hip replacement. And it would have been nice, instead of just like writing a reflection and being graded off of our reflection and how our teacher perceives that we're like participating or performing in class, it would have been nice to have more of these like ungraded or like the contract grades, and like looking at that as like a way to kind of explain more of like how you're functioning in class and saying it, because I mean it is in dance, like sometimes yes there is the right and wrong of like what to do in technique, but there's also like, well, in choreography this is where I felt like going and it's artistic, and to me it makes sense, but for you it may look weird and look stupid, but to me I like it and I want to show that off. So I think it would have been nice to have more of that being a student. And I know when we did have it, we all really appreciated it, because we were able to express more of who we were and felt more to be free as a creative artist, and not set to these like confines of what the department felt like we should be.
And encouraging more creativity is a good thing.
Yeah, that's an area that I struggle with grading for a lot of reasons, but sometimes I see students who just work so hard and don't maybe have as much of a background, or they're not great illustrators, and it hurts my brain a little bit, because I don't want to discourage that. So yeah, I'm very open to being in more of these groups and kind of helping figure all that out.
I feel the same way, Kara. That's actually like for a while now, you know, in the poetry writing classes, I grade them, but their work is graded based on completion only. So I'm like, it's right in the syllabus, you know, I'm like, okay, there are 2 criteria. Did you do it? And did you turn it in on time? And if you do those 2 things, then you get a 100. And it seems to, especially in the introductory classes, they really like that, because many of them are not super confident. They're trying out poetry writing for the very first time. They have no experience with this kind of thing. It's scary, you know, but I haven't been, that was kind of like my first step into this kind of space, you know what I mean? But it like all of them have given me really positive feedback about, yes, okay, like I understand that there are deadlines and those are important, and that I need to do the work, but that you're not going to grade me on like the quality of my work. And in an intro class, it works pretty well.
And that's the classic labor-based grading system. And some people object that you should be measuring quality work, but you know, a lot of training programs are labor-based. That when physicians do a residency, it's based on how many hours and weeks and so forth that they've done in that activity. And you know, it's an approach which is becoming much more common, and it does break down some of those barriers that students might have.
Well,
And
at least I'm in a practice-based media, and it makes sense, because the more you practice it, the better you are going to be, probably. Not necessarily, but probably. So yeah.
Well, practice with feedback especially. So giving feedback is still kind of essential, so that students can still see that they can improve on the work, but just grading based on completion is increasingly popular, especially in tasks like writing, because it's really easy for students to get discouraged and to give up early on. And this could get them past it.
I have kind of a question, comment kind of thing. So I did my grad research on dance and disabilities and looking at, there's not a lot of dancers with physical disabilities within like a college program. A lot of them don't feel welcome in the college program, but you see a lot of like summer camps for kids or like professional companies, but there's not that like middle road. And I wonder if like this grading would help them feel more welcome so they don't feel like they have to meet those like set standards of like what a dancer's body should look like and how they should function in the class. And like if this would help them feel more welcome. I don't know if there's any research that you found that like for those with disabilities, if they feel more welcome, or if that's somewhere that hasn't been touched or looked at quite as much yet.
I don't think it has been, but that could be an interesting research project if you wanted to do some research on that. Because the whole shift is really relatively, some of the things go back a while, but most of the discussion of ungrading really only goes back like 6 or 7 years. And specification grading goes back about the same amount of time. So, these things weren't really questioned all that much, at least in the mainstream research literature and education. But now would be a really good time to explore these possibilities.
Gary, there's a DEI conference at SUNY Albany, and they have a call out for abstracts that are all about like diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it might be an interesting thing, like if this is something that you've noticed, it might be worth designing your class around this a little bit this semester or something, and maybe doing a proposal and going to that conference, which would be a great way to kind of put your ideas out there and see what people have to say about it.
Yeah, thank you. I did my thesis on looking like how we got from sideshows to disability dance as an art form, and like how the ADA has helped and not really helped much in the world of dance and disabilities. So yeah, it's definitely something I want to like continue with, and I had to like really narrow it down for that project, but I wanted to look more into like why aren't programs like available for dancers with disabilities and like the collegiate level, because I mean, I've been in 2, and then any research I've done, like I've maybe found 3 that say they have like an adaptive program or an inclusive program. So it's definitely something I want to look more into for sure.
One thing I'd encourage you to do though is to, if you're going to put together a research proposal, submit it to the IRB so you'd be able to publish it and so forth, and there wouldn't be any questions. Because I know journals do require IRB approval before they'll publish any human subjects resource, and it's just research. And it's just a good practice anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I hope we'll see people experimenting, and we'll hear back from you later.
Thanks for having this.
Thanks. Good seeing everybody. Stop the recording.